The USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research acknowledges our presence on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Tongva and Kizh Nation peoples and their neighbors from north to south, the Chumash, Tataviam, Katanamuk, Serrano, Cahuilla, Payom-Kuichum, Ahashiman, Ipai-Tipai, the Kumeyaay, and the Quechan peoples whose ancestors ruled the region we now call Southern California for at least 9,000 years. Indigenous stewardship and rightful claims to these lands have never been voluntarily relinquished nor legally extinguished. We pay respects to the members and elders of these communities, past and present, who remain caretakers and advocates of these lands, river systems, and waters and islands of the Santa Barbara Channel. For a more detailed land acknowledgement that has even more context, we encourage you to visit the website of the USC Van Hunnick History Department, where you will find a detailed land acknowledgement. We'd love to know where those of you who are watching us on Zoom are joining us from, so feel free to let us know in the chat. I see you already have been. And if you'd like to know what Indigenous territory you're on, my colleague Maya will be posting a link where you can investigate that, and feel free to share that in the chat as well. Remember, when you're typing in the chat, there's a little drop down where you can select whether your message is visible to everyone or to just hosts and panelists. So if you want everyone to know where you're watching from, you can choose that there. So my name is Martha Stroud. I'm the Associate Director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research. And on behalf of the center, I'm very pleased to welcome those of you in person and those of you joining us online. Part of my duties at our events is to talk a little bit for the people online about the Zoom protocols. We're going to have time for questions and discussion, and we really invite and encourage the participation of everybody in the room and also everyone in the virtual room. You can share your questions and comments in the chat using the Q&A feature at the bottom. And if you feel so bold as to ask your questions on audio, you can click the raise hand button and we'll see how that goes. It's always an adventure. When considering how to ask your question, please keep in mind that we are recording this and the recording will be made widely available afterwards. So if you're concerned about privacy, keep that in mind when asking your question. And my colleague Maya is going to read the questions from Zoom out loud for the sake of the recording and for Ryan, who's not going to be staring at Zoom. I wanted to mention that the USC wireless network has been having some issues the past couple of days. So we appreciate your patience with maybe some lags or quality issues with the slides. I mean, we have to be online using this network. As I mentioned, we are recording the lecture, and the recording will be made available via our website, our newsletter, and our YouTube channel afterwards. So if the quality does dip and you just can't stand it, we'll be able to watch it. In fact, we will email the recording to everyone who registered for the lecture. So you'll be sure not to miss it. So now to introduce today's lecturer and today's speaker, I'll introduce the founding director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research, Chappell Guerin Chair in Jewish Studies and Professor of History at USC, Wolf Gruner.
Thank you, Marta, as always. Also, thank you, Maya and Yamur, for the preparation of this event. I'm also kind of reiterating the welcome here in the room and online. The USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research was founded in 2014 and concentrates its effort on developing an innovative interdisciplinary research agenda focusing on 3 distinct areas. One is resistance to genocide and mass violence, another violence, emotion, and behavioral change, and the last one is digital genocide studies. The center organizes a rich academic program with events like this, holding each year an international conference, hosting numerous fellows as Ryan Sun today, and also visiting scholars, and other unique research opportunities are offered by the center. We are here for a presentation of this year's Breslauer, Rutman, and Anderson Research Fellow. The Breslauer, Rutman, and Anderson Research Fellowship is awarded annually to an outstanding advanced standing PhD candidate from any discipline for dissertation research focused on testimonies of the USC Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive, and also for using other resources we have in Holocaust and genocide studies at USC. The fellowship enables the recipient to spend 1 month in residency here at the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research during the academic year, and then to deliver a public lecture like this today. The fellowship is made possible through the generosity of Gerald Breslauer, Mickey Rutman, and Tammy Anderson. So we are very grateful for their.
They're in the room virtually.
Oh, so we say hello to them, and really we are very grateful for their support. So to introduce this year's fellow, Ryan Sun, he is a PhD candidate coming to us from Canada. He is at the Department of History of the University of British Columbia. He has earned his master's in history at the same University of British Columbia, but his BA with distinction in history at the University of Toronto, where he also minored in English and German studies. His dissertation research focuses on the entangled histories of the British Empire at the Holocaust, specifically through the experiences of Austrian and German Jewish refugees in the British colonies of Hong Kong and Singapore. He is already publishing. He published an article in the Journal of Holocaust Studies with kind of, I think, a first preview of where the dissertation is going, looking at Hong Kong as an overlooked kind of element of Holocaust history, which was published last year. He has extensive teaching experiences and presented his research already at conferences and workshops in Canada, the UK, and the United States. He is also interested in public history, serving as the digital projects coordinator for the Vancouver Holocaust Education Center, Vancouver's leading Holocaust museum. He talked about what the museum does with the collection of oral history testimonies in the spring 2020 issue of the museum's magazine, Saho. So please give a warm hand to Ryan Sun.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Ryan, and I'm very glad to be here. Slightly nervous as well. I've practiced this presentation a few times, and it should be around 40 minutes, but we'll see how that really goes. But before I begin, I want to thank Martha, Wolf, and Maya for all their assistance in helping me getting settled in this month-long fellowship and just offering me the opportunity to use the Shoah Foundation testimonies. My stay at USC has been wonderful. I've gotten so much sunlight and vitamin D in the first 2 weeks. I was here. Vancouver has no sun in this moment. And right now it's in the middle of a blizzard or something, so they're not really looking forward to going back there. Anyways, let me begin. So this talk is really about what happened on board the ships that took Jewish refugees to Shanghai. The journey itself took around 4 weeks, and including stopovers at various British port cities. Yet much of the scholarly literature and historical fiction have ignored or overlooked this period in transit. Hence, my overarching question is pretty straightforward. What did Jewish refugees do during this 4-week period journey to Shanghai? This line of thinking expands as we center on the ship as this space of possibilities. Did they talk with other passengers? Did they make friends? Did they think about what they left behind in Germany or Austria and about the uncertainties in Shanghai? Did they think about non-Europeans, if at all? Well, how were kids' experiences and memories different to or similar to adults? And finally, were they bored? These are the types of questions that I hope to address in today's talk. Perfect. I want to begin with a brief history of Jewish refugee migration to Shanghai. In the 1840s, Britain defeated the Qing Empire in the First Opium War and demanded 5 treaty ports opened for European traders. Shanghai was one of them. Subsequently, Western powers like France and the United States forced similar diplomatic concessions from the Qing, allowing European traders to establish a permanent presence in Shanghai. In the 1860s, the British and American settlements opted to merge their administrations together to form the Shanghai International Settlement. The French chose not to and continued to administrate their settlement separately. Surrounding these two settlements of Shanghai was the larger Chinese-administered portion of the city. The ambiguous legal position of the international settlement, which acknowledged Chinese sovereignty but operated outside of it, ensured that Europeans did not require visas to enter the city. So on this map, the international settlement is this top part up here, and the French concession, I believe, is around here, and everywhere else is the Chinese portion of Shanghai. The Jewish community in the international settlement varied over time. Initially, it consisted of a small group of Sephardic Jews who worked as merchants and traveled along the routes of British imperial expansion. Families such as the Sassoons, the Kadoris, and the Hardoons soon established themselves as Shanghai's wealthy and philanthropic Jewish elites. From the late 1800s onwards, the demographics changed with the arrival of Ashkenazi Jews. These European Jews were primarily Russian Jews escaping pogroms, which culminated with the refugees of the 1917 Russian Revolution and onwards. Hence, during the period of German and Austrian Jewish migration in the late 1930s and 1940s, Shanghai already had a very vibrant Jewish community. Turning from Shanghai to Nazi Germany, 1938 was a pivotal moment for many German and Austrian Jews. In March 1938, the Anschluss, or union with Austria, created a whirlwind of rapid anti-Semitic violence for Austrian Jews. On November 9th and 10th, the state-sponsored Kristallnacht pogroms targeted Jews across the Third Reich. Both events were turning points for many Jews as they began to look for ways out. But emigration was not an easy task. Applicants faced numerous barriers: a slow and sometimes hostile consular bureaucracy, wait lists for quotas, and obtaining necessary permits and certificates. All this work was done alongside packing. Immigration restrictions limited what Jews could take out with them. All immigrants were allowed only 10 Reichsmarks. Only 2 suitcases of luggage could be taken, so many household goods were either sold, given to friends or family, or just left behind. Many took with them the necessities like clothing, as well as utensils, plates, and cloths, whatever was permitted to set up their new household. Jewelry, gold, and anything of value was forbidden and had to be surrendered, but that didn't stop Jewish refugees from trying and sometimes succeeding in smuggling things out. Getting tickets to Shanghai was another issue. A few shipping companies ran routes to Shanghai. The German Norddeutsche Lloyd and the Japanese Nippon Yusen Kaibushiki had both had limited services to East Asia. The most popular and well-known was the Italian Lloyd Trestino. Their Far East line was serviced by 4 luxury liners: the Conte Biancamano, the Conte Vierda, the Conte Rosso, and the Giulio Cesare, names that became familiar to Jewish refugees. As the necessity of escape increased, so too did the demand for tickets. There were 3 classes of tickets that could be purchased: first class, second class, and third class. Third class is sometimes called economy class as well. In general, the tickets for the cheapest class were always sold out immediately, but for those first class tickets, given their high prices, were usually still available. And depending on the time and immediacy of one's departure, there was often very little option but to purchase the expensive tickets. However, many interviewees remember purchasing first-class tickets solely because of the Nazi restriction on taking money out of the country. If they didn't use their money, they would lose it. Some Jewish refugees also converted their Reichsmarks into board money, vouchers that were only valid on the ships they were taking. So in these different contexts, German and Austrian Jews gathered at the train stations in Berlin, Vienna, and other cities, and took a train across the German-Italian border and waited for their ship to depart from Genoa, Naples, or Venice. My talk today uses interviews from the USC Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive. As a subject term, Shanghai registered over 500 plus interviews. Narrowing this down by specific ship numbers reduces the number significantly, between 20 to 60 depending on the ship. Additionally, part of this process also involved prioritizing interviews by the age of the interviewee. I divided them into two groups, those born before 1920 and those born between 1921 and 1930. I also included one or two that were born in 1932, but anything beyond that I kind of did not prioritize. This latter group, these children's oral histories, were particularly revealing in terms of what they remembered and also their self-reflections. In addition to age, the interviews I listened to were primarily also from those who boarded the Italian Lord Triestino ships. The Conte Biancomano made up the largest portion, followed by the Conte Verde and the Conte Rosso. Overall, 45 to 50 interviews constitute the foundation of today's talk. How and what did Jewish refugees feel once they boarded their luxury liners? For this, I draw on Christopher Browning's idea of core memories, that amongst the various oral history consulted for this project, there were certain key points that were shared that could become a collective memory. I push this further by taking seriously the affective or emotional dimensions of individual oral histories, particularly those of children's experiences. Rather than a clear linear narrative, my aim here in my talk today is kind of to provide snippets drawn from these feelings and experiences at sea. For many children, their time at sea was one of excitement and pure joy. 7-year-old Rosemary Siegler recalled how, quote, it was a very good adventure for me, end quote. She stated that it was amazing to be wearing a swimsuit and playing in the ship's swimming pool, despite it being December, the month that she and her family escaped. 10-year-old Sigmund Tobias also remembers using the swimming pool and even getting a suntan. These activities were also seldom done alone. The children of Jewish refugees quickly became acquainted with one another and became friends with one another and played with each other. 9-year-old Estella Hayden recalls how when the Conte Biancomano encountered a rough patch of sea, she and a group of children went to the ballroom, put chairs in the corner, sat on them, and waited for the waves to hit. Estella recalled fondly that because the floors were very polished, the children were sliding back and forth. For Helga Ross, her first encounter with the Conte Verde was an unfortunate one. She actually broke her shin after a fall on board and was required to wear a cast. But this also allowed her to become good friends with an older Austrian Jewish girl. And this girl helped Helga move around, either by giving her a piggyback ride or offering a shoulder to lean on as they walked. But for adults, the experience was a bit more varied. Many only truly felt free once at sea. 20-year-old Paul Freund remembers how he and other passengers chatted with each other. He states, quote, for us, the most important thing was that we were out of Europe and that we were free. And then, of course, we knew that it would not be easy to make a living there, but somehow we hoped that we would survive. Anka Wojtecki from Prague also on board the Conte Verde in April 1940 with her husband and children. But her initial reaction upon hearing the possibility of escaping to Shanghai was negative. Quote, if we die here in Prague. My God, China. Yet once on board, she acknowledged that it was pretty much a necessity to escape and to get as far as possible from the Nazis. For Miriam Buchfelder, who was 14 years old, she remembered that her parents found great significance in escaping. Coming from a very religious household, the day that they crossed the Suez Canal also coincided with Passover. Her parents' self-identification with the Jews of Exodus prompted very strong feelings. These children's interviews also opened up space for self-reflection. As Kurt Melkischer stated, quote, we children didn't have a care in the world. It was only much later that I can imagine my parents' attitude, leaving with nothing. Similarly, Rosemary Siegler only learned much later, after her and her family's arrival in Shanghai, that her mother was extremely upset because she had to leave her family behind in Germany. While children and adults certainly had different experiences and recollection, they shared the same social space on the ship. As the days passed, many Jewish refugees began chatting and networking with each other. 18-year-old Gertrude Grunberg recalled how there was dancing and that young people were generally having a good time. 14-year-old Gertrude Jelinek strongly remembered how some of the young people were flirting with each other, including herself. And although her parents trusted her, Jelinek's mother was apparently very protective and kept a watchful eye over her flirting. For 20-year-old Elizabeth Kahn, the Conte Biancamano was where she met her future husband, Herman, who proposed to her after knowing Elizabeth for less than 2 weeks. Let's give her a listen.
So you met Mr. Kahn on board the ship somewhere near the Suez Canal, and he proposed to you that night. What happened next?
What happened next is he was in first class. His sister, that's the way his sister got a ticket for him. Didn't have any money on him, but he was first class. And he couldn't sleep anymore. It was hot. We were in the third class. We slept on deck. I slept between my parents because they protected me from everything. He was up on the deck on the first class, looking down early in the morning, see if I'm still sleeping there beside my parents. And he was very good to my parents from the first day he laid eyes on them until they died. He brought us fruit, and the first thing he gave to my parents, and then to me.
So how did he asked you, had already asked you to marry him on that first night?
I told my parents.
And what was their reaction?
I'm crazy, he said.
So how did the relationship on board progress after that?
Well, we were very happy. We tried to be together as much as we could.
You had said yes to his proposal?
Of course I said yes.
Had you set it then a date for the wedding?
Well, he wanted it on the ship.
And your parents were opposed to that?
No, yes. We said we'll give it some time.
In these testimonies, the ship played an active role in facilitating intimate relationships. Even the crew were remembered as friendly and kind. Charles Colzer remembered how at the end of their voyage to Shanghai, their Italian attendant commented in German that his parents were very appreciative and never complained. His parents didn't even know the attendant understood German. Likewise, Paul Freund remembers that the Conte Biancamano's crew and captain were friendly to him and other passengers. He didn't recall experiencing any anti-Semitism from them. Joseph Brown was a bit more pessimistic in his outlook. The Italian crew were kind, yes, but that was because the passengers had paid for their ticket and expected this kind of service. However, other oral testimonies remind us of the long-lasting impact of Nazi rule. As a 10-year-old boy, Kurt Polak enjoyed the adventures on board the ship. But his father had been sent to a concentration camp and tortured before release. Kurt remembered other men like his father. On board, they were extremely reserved, paranoid, and generally kept to themselves. But halfway into the journey, these men slowly opened up about their experiences in the camps. For Anka Wotecki, she and her husband went to breakfast on the first day of the voyage and were shocked at the number of people with shaved heads. Anka remembered how, because these passengers had been mistreated and given inadequate diets, the food on the ship was too rich and caused many to suffer from terrible pains. These stories demonstrate that escape did not mean a complete break from Nazi violence, rather the physical and mental trauma endured.
You met?
These luxury liners to Shanghai were also disruptive spaces, a heterotopia whereby an ocean-based hierarchy embodied through the ticket class system determined the amount of luxury passengers were able to access. The ship also served as an introduction to the Orient, from the benign experiences of seasickness and the heat, to encounters with non-European peoples and places. In some ways, the ship became a mobile site through which German and Austrian Jewish refugees were brought into the folds of colonialism and ideas of whiteness that reconstituted them, if temporarily, into Europeans. The ship is divided into 3 classes. One's ticket class determines their level of access to luxuries, amenities, and spaces. The stratified nature of the ship can be heard in the descriptions of accommodations and food. Sigmund Tobias had a strong memory of, quote, a sparkling pitcher of water and some fruit on a bowl in their first-class accommodations. Rosemary Siegler recalled that their first-class cabin had a blue-tiled bathroom along with a porthole window that gave them an excellent view. But for those in third class, the experience was much more muted. Edith Pulver and many other interviewees stated that their third-class rooms were poor and disliked the fact that it was located at the bottom of the ship. Sigmund and C.L. Solander celebrated their honeymoon on board the Conte Biancamano. They both slept in separate third-class cabins, each with 3 other strangers. Food was another divisive topic. Those in first class had gourmet, multi-course meals, and at least a few of these dinners were formal black tie events, which were forbidden from children. Estella Hayden stated that during these events, the children had to eat before their parents. She recalled how she and other children were mad and felt excluded when they saw the waiters carrying plates filled with flaming flambe or pudding. In contrast, third-class meals tended to be much simpler. Pasta. Kurt Weiss stated that the food on the Conte Verde was, quote, normal food like we eat in a restaurant. Ralph Mannheimer stated that he and his family, quote, ate well, not good food, but I remember eating well. Interestingly, one commonality shared between the first class and the third class was that there was always wine accompanying these food. So at the very least, they did get something nice, I guess. But despite this supposedly strict hierarchy, passengers found ways around it. Children, for example, would run freely up and down the first-class hallways or explore around the ship. Whether or not they were told off by the crew or staff is uncertain. Adults, too, found ways to circumvent these restrictions. In 23-year-old Hans Eisenstadt's oral history, he recalled how he courted the daughter of an Austrian couple in first class. Seeing a potential son-in-law, her father invited Hans, who was in third class, to join them in first class for meals and dances. Intentional or not, Hans kind of improved his own situation en route to Shanghai. For Sigmund Solander, he became friendly with the chief steward. This relationship helped Sigmund, demonstrating the importance of interpersonal relationships or interpersonal connections in opening possibilities to enter first-class spaces. Let's give Sigmund a listen.
I was helping the chief steward writing out place cards for the upper class, for the first class, writing out the menu card. So he always gave us food that was destined for the first class. He gave us such a large quantity that I shared it with many people there, in particular with one particular family that came from Vienna. Lovely family. Once we reached Bombay, we were able to get a cabin. The chief steward arranged it that we got a cabin our own.
So Sigmund was able to get a first-class cabin, an upgrade from his third-class cabin. While the ship offered the possibility for Jewish refugees to return to pre-Nazi times, it also facilitated first encounters with the Orient. Both the heat and seasickness were conditions passengers regularly commented on. It was hot, or that they were sweating because they were wearing ill-suited clothes, or that they were either the only ones to get seasick or the only ones not to. Yet, as the ship began its voyage, crossing the Suez Canal and docking in British colonial port cities, the ship journey and experience took on a very touristic dimensions. For those who left before the outbreak of World War II in Europe, it was possible to disembark in these various stopovers: Aden, Calcutta, Bombay, Colombo, Singapore, Manila, Hong Kong. For Gary Biggis, he remembers his parents and him being invited by a local Jewish man in Singapore to have lunch with him at his house. There was no relation there. Hilda Veiniga also recalls getting off at Singapore with another female passenger, and together they visited the passenger's parents. Eva Gottheiner recalls that when the ship docked at Manila, she and her parents were allowed off and immediately visited some family friends for lunch. Rosemary Siegler mentioned that her father disembarked at every stopover to go and explore local synagogues. Marjorie Rosenthal, then a 10-year-old child, was initially traumatized in Hong Kong because she was required to get inoculated for tropical diseases like malaria. But to placate the crying Marjorie, her father bought her doll, Susie, a new embroidered dress. Then she recalled enjoying Chinese noodle dishes and went on to go sightseeing around Hong Kong Island. For Ralph Mannheimer, he remembers trading an old mechanical pencil for 3 pineapples after they docked in Colombo. He shared one with his family and attempted to eat the 2 others by himself, but he got sick. Let's listen to Herbert Fabian's experiences in British India.
Bombay was very interesting and very dirty. Singapore was interesting. Colombo was interesting. All these places were very, very hot. And we were able for a penny or anything we had, any little old German coins, we could buy pineapple and we could buy bananas, not 1 or 2, but a whole bunch, you know, and coconuts. Those 3 items you could buy for nothing. If you had a pocket knife that you wanted to get rid of, you could get half the world for that. I mean, all kinds of tropical fruit and all sorts of things.
These descriptions of seeing and touring non-European places are heard throughout many oral histories. But this touristic dimension or gaze is perhaps best exemplified by a rare film footage taken by Walter Rauscher on board the French ship Aramis bound for Manila. The Aramis had stopovers at many of the same ports that Italian ships docked. This is a 3-minute silent clip, so there's no audio. Sorry, I just need to get to the actual. And it is a scene taken in Hong Kong. So the rickshaw pulling was a very interesting scene for me as well. It's just the staged nature of it. They did not do it just once, but twice for different people, but they were setting it up. They were trying to experiencing what was going on. They were being tourists. This is another scene in Hong Kong as well, of just a road with a Chinese patrolman or traffic and then there is one more. This scene, I believe, is still in Hong Kong. I just don't exactly remember where it is. It's somewhere in Central, I think. but it's the stairs that really remind me of the space. But what is also important or very interesting from this film footage is that it's just such a rare item to have, and it's in the US HMM. And the content of this film, its simple existence, just suggests that as Jewish refugees were seeking refuge and shelter outside of Nazi Germany, the ship journey itself became an adventure for many, a tour, a source of excitement. And it goes on for, I think, like 20 or 30 minutes, and this is just one of the films. I think there are 3 other films that you can watch, but the other 2 are more in Manila and once they arrive in the Philippines. As shown in Rauscher's footage, non-Europeans were present and called these port cities their homes. Non-European passengers also boarded many of these same ships that carried Jewish refugees. Why then has there been a lack of focus on non-Europeans in these oral histories? Or if your non-Europeans were mentioned, in what context were they? Reaching the Suez Canal was the beginning of the adventure of entering the Orient. After disembarking from a ship, George Horitz stated that, quote, "This was my first experience of a North African city. I was just amazed at the horrible, horrible mess in Port Said." While George doesn't expand on what the horrible, horrible mess was exactly, it does register a difference. Port Said wasn't what he was used to, and possibly a foreshadowing of what to come. Rosemary Siegler also had strong memories associated with crossing the Suez Canal because, quote, "I saw my first black person. I've never seen a black person before, so I remembered that," end quote. For Rosemary, she may have seen her first black person, but to this individual, the presence of Europeans in the area could not have gone unnoticed. One group mentioned a few times were Indian passengers. Both Gertrude Grunberg and Britta Wachs specified a few Indian passengers as a prince or a doctor or a Maharaja's niece. They were also mentioned as wealthy, probably because these encounters took place with Indian passengers in these first-class spaces. Non-Europeans also took second and third-class journeys, but often boarded from Calcutta or Bombay for Singapore and vice versa. The general dearth of mentions is particularly due to both a limitation on the interviewee's memories of specific facts, but also from the interviewer and institution's interests. Oftentimes, a conversation was ended to move on to the next topic on the list, or worse, the interviewer interrupts and abruptly stops the interviewee's line of thought. However, a few surviving written materials offer more problematic insights into this first encounter. A series of letters were written by Annie Whittings, a Jewish refugee who was on board a ship bound for Shanghai. One letter sent from Bombay recounted Annie's interactions with some Indian passengers in first class. She was extremely impressed by these men as they spoke fluent English, in contrast to her German accented English. And they were dressed in a European style, studied in England, and came from, quote, good families. To Annie, they were a proper example that other Europeans could learn from. What is interesting is just this highlighting of Europeanness. What I see here is how the Jewish refugee, once on board the ship, could be reconstituted as a temporary European and brought adjacent to the structures of colonialism and imperialism. This transformation lasted particularly during the ship journey, but may have continued after their arrival in Shanghai. As Jewish refugees were folded into whiteness, was there a nascent sense of affiliation with other Europeans, or just a heightened sense of or realization of their own difference? Upon arriving in Shanghai, Arthur Doldish remembered that the city was exotic and different. He then compares himself to being a Chinese or a black person in Vienna, and how everyone would have stopped and stared because there aren't that many Chinese or black people in Vienna. He was now one of the few Europeans in a British colony surrounded by much larger Chinese, Malay, and Indian communities. This recognition of difference and potential association with Europeanness was clearer in oral histories that talk about children's experiences. For 14-year-old Gary Biggis, the experience transiting through the different ports was a learning moment. It made him feel different. Quote, "I didn't have a feeling of being better or worse, but just being different," end quote. And for 7-year-old Heinz Amore, who was on board the Conte Rosso with his parents, his comments offer additional insights into how children may have understood their relationship to non-Europeans. After arriving at their Hong Kong stopover, he recalled saying, quote, "I don't know if I was a racist, but I said to my mother, geez, the people are white again," end quote. What made Hines' statement so fascinating is both the candid nature of his response and the additional self-reflection, a strength of oral histories in general. By prefacing his statement that "I don't know if I was a racist," Hines allows room for possibilities, that he was, that he wasn't, and an ability to reflect on past actions. What is revealing is that he also makes an implicit acknowledgement that for part of the journey, the people he saw at the ports did not look like him. Finally, an unsettling account by Susan Julius reveals how one's upbringing and social position may have informed their outlooks. After crossing the Suez Canal, she recalled seeing her first black person, who was wearing a fez. But unlike Rosemary, who was surprised at this, Susan started to cry. She clarified in her interview that in 1930s Germany, there were these, quote, horrible children's songs that demonized black people, saying that they would bite and eat children. Where and how do we situate these experiences that touch on how notions of race, whiteness, and difference are understood, particularly from children? In contrast to oral histories, the few surviving written materials paints a more problematic picture. And again, returning to Annie Whiting's letters, her descriptions of the ports she transited and the non-Europeans she's seen or met fall squarely within the kind of travel writing that Mary Louise Pratt has written on. Not only a touristic gaze, but a particular colonial gaze that touches on the trope of the uncivilized. After docking at Massawa, which is, I think, around modern-day Somaliland, she recorded an interesting scene involving a Somalian family that boarded the Conte Verde. A member of this family apparently sat on the railing for 2 hours, longingly staring at the piano in first class, when suddenly he sprang up, pressed one of the keys, and reacted in delight to the sound. She described this individual's action as that of a child, that they, quote, are all stuck at an infantile stage, end quote. In Colombo, she described the indigenous quarters as, quote, uncultured and primitive. She goes further to dehumanize its inhabitants as these Schwarzen, these blacks. She denied them their humanity, the very same reasoning which motivated the Whitings' departure from Nazi Germany. This attempt at rendering non-Europeans into an undefined mass was not an uncommon in colonial travel literature. The faceless masses in Shanghai, or simply comments about one's shock at the number of people in the port city, was a common point raised by a few individuals. In a diary written by an anonymous passenger, their ship's arrival to Colombo saw some of the Indian and South Asian passengers waiting on the deck. This prompted the author to label them as, quote, a swarm of dark people, end quote, while describing their ways of eating using only their hands as, quote, directly unappetizing, end quote. There was never an average non-European in these travelogues, if we could say that. When Indians or Chinese individuals appear, it was either because they presented themselves visually as European and or had a European education, or they were completely the opposite, uncivilized and infantilized. Before turning to the last part of this talk, I do want to be very clear. I'm not stating that all Jewish refugees are racists. What I am saying are two things. First, that some Jewish refugees replicated the language of race and civilization in describing non-European peoples and places. Second, that a focus on how the ideas and structures of whiteness and Europeanness, particularly in a colonial context, could have brought Jewish refugees into its fold is something to consider when engaging with the global dimensions of the Holocaust. So, to the final part of my presentation. Alongside the excitement of the journey, of this travel, of this tour through coastal Asia, another human experience was felt: boredom. To the best of my knowledge, boredom as a concept has not been discussed in Holocaust studies literature. And for good reasons. How would one productively approach boredom? Among the various testimonies I have listened to, only 2 interviewees made references to feeling bored. Edith Pulver departed on the 2nd of January 1939 on board the Conte Biancamano and arrived in Shanghai on her birthday, February 1st. She described her journey as, quote, endless. To me, it was endless. Never could have ended. I thought I'd never come, end quote. Sailing in third class with accommodations in the bottom of the ship and taking care of her toddler, this trip was nothing short of horrible. And although she did not explicitly suggest boredom, the fact that she felt it was never ending is indicative of the state of mind that being trapped on board a ship could elicit. Whereas Edith was a bit more ambiguous in her response, Hans Nieter's comment was more direct. When the interviewer asked Hans to describe his experience of the ship journey to Shanghai, Hans responded that the journey was pleasant and comfortable. Yet it was his following response that really piqued my interest. Quote, nothing, sleeping, eating, we were having a good time. But isn't this response somewhat contradictory? Hans said he did nothing, and yet he lists out the activities he did. So how come he viewed it as such? As historian Susan Crane argues, quote, nothing is delightfully ambiguous and deviously precise, a word to be used when no other word suffices, end quote. It was not that nothing happened, something happened, but that something was a condition of leisure, of relaxation. Surrounded by the sea, passengers did what they could to alleviate boredom. And as we've heard from various interviewees, they danced, they chatted, they had fun on board the ship. It was this nothing real and assumed that plagues Shanghai Jewish refugees' oral histories. But beyond the ship, could boredom be applied elsewhere, to those in hiding, to those resisting, to those in the concentration camps? Boredom may perhaps have more to tell us. This talk has been really a whirlwind of experiences on board ships bound for Shanghai. The ship was a space where Jewish refugees chatted with fellow passengers and crew members, developed friendships and relationships that lasted well into their time in Shanghai. They ate Italian food, drank Italian wine, they suffered seasickness or languished under the heat. For many, the ship journey was an adventure and an extended tour. But the ship also disrupted land-based hierarchies. The ticket class system meant some passengers riding first class reclaimed and even expanded on the freedoms they had lost under Nazi rule. But third class passengers faced difficulties and limited access to amenities. As a disruptive force, the sights of the ship also facilitated and introduced Jewish refugees to the Orient. It allowed for some Jewish refugees to be reconstituted from German or Austrian Jew to European, to be brought within the folds of colonialism and whiteness. Hopefully this talk has at least offered a reconsideration of the ship as more than just a mode of transportation, but rather as a space of possibilities. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was incredible. I'm going to stop sharing your screen.
I can do that. Oh, there. Okay, perfect.
And I'd like to open the floor to questions from people in the room, and also on Zoom. We have hundreds of people watching, including people whose parents and grandparents were on ships to Shanghai, and other refugees. So we will try to get to as many questions as we can, but our time is limited. So you can, for those of you on Zoom, you can ask questions preferably with the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom of the screen, or you can ask questions in chat and Maya will navigate. Maybe we could start with Paul's question.
Yeah, you contrasted many differences between first class and third class passengers, but what was second class like?
Yeah, second class was very difficult to find, and I don't know why. From what I've heard from a few of the interviews, and really, I think it was only one or two, it was just kind of like first class, but they had less access to certain spaces. So in first class, you would have access to, say, the library, a relaxation room, certain spaces for just lounging about. But in second class, you would have a reduced amount of amenities. Second class also had their own dining hall, so each of the classes would have their own dining spaces to eat. As for food, I'm not 100% sure. A lot of the materials I've looked at really come from, or the surviving physical stuff, they're really like little brochures or pamphlets for people in first class. So I'm kind of taking or interpreting, what is not included or what is included to figure out what second class is. Third class, there's a lot more oral histories that really tell that apparently it was not that good. But second class is kind of somewhere in between, yeah.
Just to follow, what were the price differences between first, second, and third class?
That I can't really answer. I know that from off the top of my head, I can't really tell you, but I would say at least triple, if not more than third class. I can give you some of the information. I do have a few pictures or notes somewhere about like certain documents and the prices that they had on the specific ticket, but yeah, I don't remember. I'm sorry, Paul.
Thanks, fascinating talk. I've had the privilege of going to Shanghai where the Jewish refugee neighborhood is. And I never thought about how they got there with a ship ride. Very important. So thank you for that. But I do have a question that I wonder about, because I think you do a great job about like talking about the racism or the colonialism and those attitudes that kind of persist throughout that maybe they're taking from Europe or just wherever. But I wonder, is that racism or is that nationalism? Because to me, it seems to be more they're taking on a nationalistic view. And it seems to me like that's kind of, because Jews, in my opinion, don't really see themselves as a race, but more as a people made up of lots of different races. So it's not really racism, it's more nationalism taking on this, which I think is I wonder if that's.
No, that's a great question. Yeah, that's definitely something I am also kind of not exactly working with, but it's something that pops up because it's like some of these testimonies and some of these a few written sources, they really highlight a specific German dynamic or specific Austrian dynamic. How once they get to Shanghai, they're shocked that there's no concerts or no operas. Where are the operas? So it is something I'm still working through, but at the same time, as they're on these ships, they are some affiliations or affinities with associating to a generalized Europeanness. So if they do stay longer in, say, Hong Kong or in Shanghai or other refuges, then there would be a stronger association with like the national dynamic. But I see it as once they're on the ship or as they're on the ship, there's just a heightened sense of their own difference and that they do associate more with Europe. And then once they get to the destination, there's a bit more nationalist dimensions to it. But that is something I still kind of need to work through with. And going back to your first comment, yeah, this entire presentation, this is kind of like chapter 1 of my dissertation. I never really thought about that. So in my prospectus, this wasn't exactly mentioned, but then now I'm like, oh yeah, I guess the ships are kind of important. So I totally have the same experience, but no, thank you for your question. Yeah.
So I have a question comment from Zoom. Well, there's a lot of questions, but I thought this one from Quentin Huang. First is the kind of the comments, and then there'll be the question at the end. It strikes me that these ships were a liminal space, not merely from the perspective of the refugees themselves, but also in terms of how these ships might have been categorized at the time and in present day scholarship. This is before the post-war refugee regime and before many governments were aware of or cared about the persecution of German Jews. And I wonder how these ships were compared to other refugee ships during this time. The Komagata Maru comes to mind. At the same time, the tourism section also brings to mind the infrastructure of imperial tourism, both British and Japanese during this time, which created new connections and amenities across this area. And here's the question. How were these ships understood at the time by both its passengers and the various governments and societies that encountered them? Like as a refugee ship navigating geographies of escape, a tourism ship navigating geographies of leisure, or an imperial ship navigating geographies of empire?
That's a good question, Quentin. Quentin's from UBC, so like he's an MA, in the history department. So I'll give you a more detailed answer when I come back. But in my view, it's whether or not, in my view, like from what I see from the various, particularly just from Hong Kong, I would say, because that's where my focus is in, there was no real concern about the ship itself as a specific imperial ship or a specific refugee ship. There was knowledge that these ships carried a lot of Jewish refugees. But because, at least in Hong Kong and Singapore at that time, as British colonies, they needed visas to get in. There was no true concern that they would overstay or they would even be allowed off ship, especially towards the later half of 1939. And this kind of works with the local Jewish communities in these various refuges who take on, I guess, some of the responsibilities of ensuring that these passengers don't get off the ship, that even if they do, they're only here for a few hours, maybe one day, but they will go back onto the ship. So perhaps they do see them as refugee ships or a specific entity, but they see them more as something to not allow in, if that makes sense, Quentin. But anyways, I'll talk to you later. I'll talk to you when I get back. But thank you for the question, Quentin. Okay.
I read a few memoirs of those Jewish refugees. So what I have learned is that there are different nationalities. Some are from Hungary or Austria or even German. When they arrived at Shanghai ports, they were somehow like being helplessly supported by Sephardi Jews or Ashkenazi Jews. And I still remember one paragraph I read is when they were on board, get on the Shanghai ports, they have to enlist those refugees names and to try to help them. It's a single to the dormitory. If it's a family, they try to arrange to have a party for the family. So when they claim like I'm from Hungary, my name is Hans Schipper, and I still remember one of the paragraph, one of the story I read is a guy with a very nice suit claimed to the receptionist, my name is blah, 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 a German from Berlin. And in the reception, still asking, said, since today there are no more Austrian, Hungarian, or German. You are all people supported by your co-religious Jewish people. So I think there are many different nationalities on the ship.
Yeah, definitely there were Hungarian Jews, there were Jews from Eastern Europe as well, a few, particularly those who were either under direct Nazi occupation or just the expansion of Nazi Germany. But it kind of came in waves. So German and Austrians were primarily the first group, and then slowly you have a bit more Czech Jews, you had a few more Hungarian, Slovenian Jews, and then depending on after the ships or a bit after the war broke out and the ship path was no longer really viable, the Trans-Siberian Railroad was another path that they could have taken, and that would have allowed perhaps Polish Jews or again Jews from Eastern Europe to go to Shanghai. So yeah, you are right. It's not just German and Austrian Jews in Shanghai, but for the ship itself, or the ships primarily, a good chunk of them were German ethnic German Jews who spoke German and held German nationalities, but a few of them may have been German, but they held Polish passports, because at that time it was still a little, there were still like German minorities in these different places, yeah, or German-speaking minorities, yeah. But yeah, thank you. Who?
I just have a question. This kind of piggybacks on Quentin's question. Do you know if these ships were commandeered for this particular purpose, or were they ships that regularly went to China, or if they were
Right. Were they specialized, or were they just? No, this was just a regular line, like the Italian Lloyd Triestino line was just a regular line that ran from Italy to Shanghai, and maybe Japan. I'm not 100% sure, depending on the specific ship, but it was just a regular line that ran. I think like one ship every 2-ish weeks would go out, and then another one would come back, and then it just kept on going until Italy gets into war or enters the war, and then that kind of stops. Yeah.
So they were essentially just regular passengers that made a beeline for it.
Yeah, they were regular passengers that were able to, purchase a ticket when it was available, and then were able to escape, because it wasn't just because they had a ticket. it doesn't necessarily mean they could easily escape. They still had to get other requirements like specific permits or certificates, and then they had to arrange for the passports and the logistics. So there was a lot of things surrounding it, but once they got the ticket, it became a bit easier for them to get out. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
First, thank you so much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. I was proud of the part, so I really enjoyed the presentation. I have two questions. The first one is that you mentioned that children kind of remembered their time in the ship as kind of like an adventure, and that they were meeting people too. And I was wondering if you also found testimonies in which children did not have that kind of positive experience in the ships. And then my second question was in regards to this relationships that children are forming in the ships, if you knew if they continued after, upon their arrival in Hong Kong.
Yeah, I'll do the second question first and then the first question. For the second question, yes, they definitely did. A few of the testimonies, and I unfortunately don't have the names in front of me, but one of, at least two, if not more, do mention not only making friends on the ship, but that these friends remained friends as they were in Shanghai, and they had the Shanghai experience and grew up together in that area. And both of them also mentioned specifically their friends' names, and also the fact that they're still friends to this day. And I think for one of the interviews, they lived nearby each other, so they definitely had these lasting bonds with each other. As to your first question, yeah, there were a few that mentioned, depending on what the interviewer asked, kind of determined the degree of depth. But for some of these children, they do talk about how their time on board the ship was not pleasant, but mainly because it was either seasickness or something about the food. They didn't like the food. So it was, there were times where they did say they did not like it, but it was more for, yeah, the food just was not good for some reason, or they were just seasick and they did not adapt to the, I guess, the rocking of the boat. Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ryan. And I want to just kind of connect with my question to the last one. Can you elaborate a little bit about the differences, what you got out of the different interviews with children at the time and adults? Because I like that you differentiate between the two, but at some point you mentioned in the side mark, you got actually more out of children, at least it seems. Can you elaborate a little bit more? What is different about the perspective? What kinds of, let's say, experiences are highlighted by children in difference or details which you don't get from adults? And so maybe you elaborate a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. I think one of the interesting things that I found from making this distinction between the children and the adults is that with the children's experiences, they're a bit more, I don't know, one, they're a bit more, I guess, open in the sense of what they're talking about, and two, that they have this, all of them more or less have like this self-reflective dimension to it, where they say, oh, I was having so much fun, but thinking about it now, if I was my mom or my dad, it would have been a horrible time because we lost everything or we didn't know what we were doing. So that self-reflection dynamic is, I think, pretty eye-opening, particularly for the ship experience. Additionally, I think with the kids, it's because I guess in a way they did not have that much responsibilities once they were on the ship, that they could freely do a bit more things. But that also doesn't mean that they did not know what was going on. A few of them did say like how for one individual, his father was sent to Dachau, and then later on he was sent to Shanghai. He boarded a ship to Shanghai, I think, a month earlier. And while the kid was, and then the kid and his mother would follow a month later. And while they were on the ship, the child was, very excited and happy to, play with friends and everything. But at the back of his mind, he was still concerned, who would be the person that picks us up? Would it be my dad, or would it be the person that came back from Dachau, this unknown individual? So there is a bit more, I guess, working through, if that makes sense, from the child perspective. From the adult's perspective, I think it's because there's a greater I feel like for both there's like a sense of, you know, you need to have, during the interviews there needs to be that factual information, but from the adult's point of view, it's more like a stronger, I guess, need to have these factual information that a child's experience might not necessarily need, if that makes sense. But thank you for the question. And yeah, I figured out that I'm not exactly like this childhood dynamic or approach isn't really like, it's an area that I need to look more into because I completely am not trained in like childhood history. So,
It's important.
but it is important. Yeah.
People think testimonies from children are not actually kind of as valuable because they don't see many details, they don't have kind of these reflections. And so I think what you show is actually the opposite of it, that you get a lot out of these testimonies.
You get a lot more of these raw emotions. Yeah. Yes.
As someone who works as well with testimonies a lot, one often encounters the issue that someone who's 80 or 90 years old describing something that's long in the past, as sometimes you do realize that they might mix things up without any negative intent. Did you encounter that issue as well, or did you? Was there any way for you to verify the information that you had gotten out of the interview?
Yeah, that's definitely another important part because, you know, once it's not to say like if they're old and they're making stuff up, but once they get to a certain age, it's just like, you know, you're trying to pull back specific information or specific memories, and there's just sometimes just too long of a distance. I would say from the interviews I've listened to here, I haven't had that experience yet. However, when I was working for the Vancouver Holocaust Education Center, I was transcribing one interview from an individual who was, I have to say, at least 88 or older, maybe 90. So he was kind of repeating a lot of things. He wasn't really clear, and he was kind of also mumbling. But when he started talking about Shanghai and his experiences in Shanghai specifically, so not the ship, but just Shanghai, he got very, I guess, excited. Because throughout the interview, he was kind of like, you know, trying to say some stuff or giving some factual information. But when the interviewer asked, so what did you think about Shanghai? Did you enjoy your time in Shanghai? And he starts saying, oh, Shanghai, oh, beautiful city, a great city. So there is like, even in these moments where you can't really perhaps verify exactly what the individual is saying or how historically accurate the person is saying, there are certain registers, certain emotional dynamics that I think still can contribute information, can still contribute insight into their own experiences, if not just their own reflections and recollection of the past is pretty interesting in itself. Yeah. Hope that answers your question. Yeah.
In speaking with some of the interviewees, was there any, how do you say, ambivalence about how they felt in terms of knowing that they were being expelled, but then having a journey that has, you know, you have periods of excitement, maybe boredom as well, but to know that you're on a journey that wasn't necessarily your decision, but simply because you had to be expelled from your country?
Yeah, there were definitely a few people who were, a few interviewees who did kind of reflect on this, you know, forced migration, this expulsion from Germany. They were leaving in, you know, unhappy situations or unhappy conditions. And I think it really comes out when they talk about the family members who weren't able to come with them to Shanghai. There is one testimony in again, going to the Vancouver Holocaust Education Center. There was one individual who was Greta, oh shoot, I should remember her name. Her name is Greta. Gerda, her name is Gerda. And she was talking about how her father tried very hard to get his relatives, his uncles, his aunts to come with them and just extended family members to come with him because they were kind of being pushed out of Austria at that time. And few of them really took his proposal up to, one, leave Austria, and two, to go to Shanghai. a lot of them decided to stay. And what stuck with me during Gerda's recollection is that she said, you know, my father worked so hard and not a lot of people, you know, followed him. The few who did, the father's sister and, yeah, I think the father's 2 sisters, I think, and their husbands came with him. But the people who stayed just couldn't let go of their things. So there is that sense of, you know, not nostalgia, but like a sense of like a sadness in the fact that, you know, they couldn't get everyone that they wanted to come with them. But yeah, hopefully that kind of answers your question. Kurt and then Maya.
I guess in the same way that it kind of dawned on you that arriving to Shanghai, they came on ships and that was important. Many of these refugees are kind of double or triple refugees in a way, and they leave Shanghai when the Japanese invade or when the Chinese Civil War happens. Do any of them kind of describe their experience leaving Shanghai? And if there's a comparison between kind of their leaving Europe to come to Shanghai and then they're leaving Shanghai for another place, and how they thought about the journeys either similarly or differently?
They definitely do talk about leaving Shanghai as well, and the ship journeys there. I don't know if they've made that connection between the two of them. Of the ones that I did listen to, I did kind of focus a bit primarily on like the journey to Shanghai, not journey from, but of the 4 or 5 that I kind of listened to the entire testimony, they didn't really make that strong connection. They did say some. They did say things like, oh, you know, and then, you know, we left Shanghai like we came by boat. But they didn't really make us a deep, you know, reflective or reflection between just coming by boat and leaving by boat. And most of them, when they do mention leaving Shanghai, they do mention it within the context of the Chinese Civil War and saying how the communists were coming and then that they did not want any foreigners at all in Shanghai. So there was, again, another necessity, like you said, to leave the city, to become refugees again in a way. But yeah, no, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, so I have some questions from Zoom. First from, and I'm gonna go down, first from Faith Goldman, were there religious services on boards? And then the second question that a lot of people have been asking, I saw like Shelley, Dan Shaw, Debbie, Mandy Gabler, we're all asking if there are ways to find these manifests or like passenger lists for the boats. So religious services on board, and then where to find these manifests.
Religious services, I'm not 100% sure. I don't think there were any. And if there were any religious observances, it would have been more individual. I know one testimony from Gertrude, and I mentioned her name here. Her family was raised, I think, Orthodox Jewish, and they were very religious. So when they were on the ship, apparently they only ate hard-boiled eggs because that was the only kosher meal available. A few did mention about trying to keep kosher on the ship, but most of them said like that they'll just you know, overlook this moment on the ship for keeping kosher. But once they get to Shanghai, they did try to continue keeping kosher. As for the second question, can you remind me what the second question?
Absolutely. I think a lot of people were really interested in, because we have so many people whose family members were on these boats, they're asking like, is there a way to find what boats my family was on? Are there like manifests or passenger lists available?
It really is like a game of like finding, was it a pin in a haystack kind of thing? Because it's very difficult to even find one of these manifests. You can look into like, you know, the USHMM, the Holocaust Museum, that would be the first start. You could also look into some of the Joint Distribution Committee archives might have some stuff there, particularly if they went to Shanghai. But then you also have like, I don't want to say random places, but places that you wouldn't think of, but kind of make sense at the end. So one of the archives in Australia has a manifest for a Japanese ship called the Husimi Maru. And this ship includes the name of one individual who I'm trying super hard to find, like, you know, collect as much information. And this document for the past, I think, like 2-3 years was not digitized, only the front and the back. But I knew that there was something there. And luckily enough, the Australian archivist there was very kind to do it for me and sent me some information from that. But really, it's a game of cat and mouse, I guess, is you really have to search around, and sometimes they just don't exist because they just don't exist anymore because they were destroyed or just forgotten. Yeah.
Thank you.
Just what about archives of the ship companies like Lloyd or something?
Yeah, that I haven't tried at all. I have something adjacent to this. I tried searching, asking the South China Morning Post newspaper for some information about, archives or stuff from the 40s. And the person who responded to me was saying, like, we don't have this. We don't even know where to begin with this. So you could ask and try to see if these shipping companies might have some information, but I think Lloyd Tristino either is defunct now or it merged with a different company. And I don't really know what happened after that. So, yeah, looking at shipping companies might be may have some stuff, but I'm not sure.
So we have about 5 minutes left for questions, and I just wanted to mention, Ryan, that there's a lot of discussion in chat about research that perhaps your project would inspire. So a lot of people are asking about what about ship journeys when people were leaving Shanghai. Someone in the chat was on a ship from Shanghai to San Francisco. In their case, they were on a freighter with refugees, soldiers, and bananas. It took 3 weeks, and they're interested in these ship journeys.
Yeah, I know in my case for Hong Kong, at least in post-war Hong Kong, there was supposed to be a ship that just transited through Hong Kong for 1 or 2 days, and then it would continue on to Australia, and the ship had like around 300, 400 Jewish refugees. But once the ship landed in Hong Kong, the Australian government requisitioned the ship for sending Australian troops back to Australia or something. So Hong Kong had 400 Jewish refugees in 1946, and they didn't know what to do with them. And then over time, you had these various ships come in and take a small chunk of people coming onto the ship and continuing on. But it became like a small little crisis for the local Jewish community, because then they had to start figuring out, okay, is this ship possible? Is that ship possible? No, that ship's not possible. This one might be, oh, now it's not possible. Okay, so there was a lot of just the ship experience itself is just a very interesting thing,
Yeah. And so I have a question from Nicola Anthony, who says, thank you, Ryan. It's so interesting thinking about boredom in this way, and your comparison to more extreme situations in concentration camps makes us stop and rethink. In your eyes, could that be also about not having a purpose, being taken away from an exciting life, or simply sustaining through crisis, this boredom?
Yeah, as I was writing the boredom part, which is also like the shortest part, so that's why I kind of stuck it to the end, because I thought, okay, I don't really have enough and I'm not sure, but I know they experienced it. But as I was writing about boredom, I was also just thinking like about the, I think Primo Levi's The Drowned and the Saved, and how I think in one of the chapters he was talking about the Musselmen and how they were kind of reduced to just being bare life. And in that point, in that instance, would even boredom be applicable there? If boredom is a human experience, can these supposedly non-humans now experience this? And that really is like a super extreme example, but I still don't really have an answer. I feel like they could still experience it, but they would have experienced it in a way that us or what people on the ship would, in a way different from the people on the ship, not one of boredom of leisure, but just boredom of repetition perhaps, or boredom of just an unendingness to their situation. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you. And then there's a lot. Let's see. I'm scanning through some more of these questions.
Okay, I think we're gonna conclude with thank you, Ryan. So
Thank you.